Good evening, everyone. My name is Lavine Hemlani. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Xccelerate. We are a future of work tech company that upskills economies, enterprises, and governments and individuals to prepare them for the future. And this evening, it's my absolute delight, pleasure, and honor to have Max with us at a fireside chat so we can discuss one of the industries that is rapidly changing with artificial intelligence, supply chain. Just for the format, for those of you who are new to our sessions tonight, we try to make these really fun and casual and make them really informative. So if there's certain things that you really want to learn and us to discuss, feel free to bring that in the chat at any point. Typically, we keep these to maximum an hour. So at any point, feel free to, in the first 45 minutes, ask questions to us in the chat. And in the last 15 minutes, we will open up to Q&A. And most of all, please have fun. Please ask us questions. Please make sure that you get the most out of this. And a copy of this will be recorded. So if some of you want to take a look at this again for your own reference, it will be on the Xccelerate YouTube channel, as well as the Xccelerate website, our main website. So thanks again, Max. And perhaps before we get started, it'd be great to give the audience a little bit of a 30-second intro on who you are.
Yeah, I was originally from the States many years ago, but have spent the bulk of my career in Asia, really in logistics or in technology, usually some sort of combination of those two things. I've been, the place where I worked the longest, something I really enjoyed was working with multinational clients at DHL, always on a regional basis. So when I think about Hong Kong or Singapore or supply chains, I really think about the region and all the countries in the region that I actually love very much and used to love traveling to. I started OpenPort, which was a digital logistics company across Asia after DHL, and spent about a year, a little bit less, running sales for an AI company in the UK called Clear AI, which was comprised of a team had a bit of a pedigree from Cambridge Analytica, and learned a lot about the big data approach there, and started Liberatrade to take those concepts and make supply chain AI accessible on a SaaS basis, really to everybody, particularly mid-sized companies in Asia.
Excellent. Great. So just for the audience's reference, could you just go a little bit further into what Liberatrade is and aspires to be?
Right. So we aspire to take the power of supply chain, enterprise, artificial intelligence to balance supply and demand for retail and other supply chains, and bring that forward to companies that want to drive our first product growth in digital sales, that want to optimize inventory, which is our second product, and that want to access capital, such as trade finance at a lower cost, which is our third product around liquidity. So integrating those three products is really what supply chain AI is in my mind, primarily. There may be other interpretations of that, but making those products accessible and easy to use for companies, particularly in Asia, consumer products and retail industries.
Got it. So why don't we take some of those applications and it's a really exciting time, especially with supply chain being disrupted at so many different levels. And why don't we go a little bit further in terms of the way you envision those solutions that you're building with Liberatrade in the supply chain context? Maybe you could go through those three, and would love to kind of understand where and how for those three AI is creating positive change and disruption in traditional supply chains.
Yeah, well, one thing to kind of explain how it began to be applied in large scale is to talk a little bit about Amazon. So before I went to the UK on the project and consultancy project that I talked about earlier, I worked for a supply chain software, logistics software company that I know in the US, and worked with them to land a large contract with Amazon Global Logistics. And then when I was up in Seattle, I started to understand how Amazon was beginning to take demand insights at the consumer level and translate those demand insights into upstream inventory and supplier planning. So the result of that is that Amazon and other companies are increasingly able to go to their customers and say, would you also like to buy these products? Other customers like you bought similar products. We can get these to you in a shorter and shorter lead time. If you don't couple those demand insights and understanding of what customers want, which is recommendation engines, simple collaborative filtering around retail buyer data history, putting that into a user interface that intelligently promotes the type of goods and products that people want to buy, and you fail to plan and to link those insights to what your upstream suppliers, whether that's in China, in a domestic market or elsewhere, are doing, then you have this imbalance. And could be a stock out in a retail environment. It could be that pricing can't be supported at a given level, but then the right hand isn't doing what the left hand really is thinking about. And it also means too much waste and inefficiency. So in order to really fine tune the supply chains and start shipping what is really needed, there's a lot of complexity. And in supply chains that are talking about thousands or even tens of thousands of SKUs, and in many cases like Unilever Indonesia, you're talking about 1 million points of sale, a myriad of different suppliers. Ironing all of that out is a great case for applied data science and machine learning. In fact, without that type of technology-based companies risk going out of business, like JCPenney and what we're hearing about the Gap and J.Crew and so on. So it's kind of increasingly, it's an existential situation for a lot of big brands and retailers. So it starts with demand, really. It starts going into what consumers are buying, what those trends lines, and it's even about applying those same concepts to business orders and business distribution of products. Because really what you have in these big supply chains is always some degree of a bullwhip effect. So millions of consumers go to small retailers to buy products. Those small retailers buy from distributors based upon what they think consumers will buy. The distributors buy from the brands, and the brands have quarterly or monthly planning based upon what they think distributors will buy. They push out their forecast to suppliers, and when they go out and tender logistics, they tender logistics frequently annually, right? And maybe they update those forecasts back to contract logistics providers on a more frequent basis, but often they don't, meaning that somebody holding goods in a warehouse might have a demand forecast that's more than a year out of date, right? And this creates huge imbalances in the ability of all the different partners in a big supply chain to do what's really needed. So by taking the first product, which is growth tools, you can drive increased sales in an omni-channel environment, in a digital environment, but even a traditional retail to distributor environment, because those orders increasingly are made with some sort of digital interface. And that it is a digitized system where you can go and look at that data and start to bring recommendation engines into that process. But if you're only doing that and you don't share your new insights around what products are going to be needed down at the store level, then you're risking stockouts and you're really basically shipping the wrong stuff. So that leads into the second product, which is inventory optimization. And so that's calibration of warehouse management systems, of transport management systems, and of demand planning, so that the guys running the warehouses know how many people to hire in certain facilities, what type of product to put in which facilities in a multi-node network covering Java, for example, or covering new territories. And they basically know how to plan the transport, what type of trucks are needed, what types of providers, what type of modes of transport for an international supply chain. And that saves the logistics provider money, and it also increases their ability to service the end customer, driving profitability through improved throughput. So those two insights are important, the ability to drive growth in average order value and increase sales, but also to really ship what is needed. But what happens when you have those two things? You start to understand what products will be needed by customers, what will be sold in the future, and what suppliers are needed for those products. So if you're standing in and you want to finance that supply chain, you start to accumulate insights on the future state of that supply chain. You could basically go out and say, we're going to finance the suppliers that we know are making the products that people want to buy, because those suppliers will be needed in the future and they have less risk. So now, where capital is slow to move, the capital can move more quickly, and the cost of that capital improves also. And this leads into the topic of sustainability, because it's a broad topic, it's used a lot, everybody talks about it, whether it's Davos or United Nations, and talk about sustainable development goals. But in many cases, sustainable development goals are abandoned by corporations, in part or in full, particularly when they get into a major crisis. And that frustrates a lot of people that are driving sustainability. But if sustainability is coupled tightly to the bottom line into key business drivers, which if you're really looking at waste and delivering what is needed and less of what is not needed, then you can achieve both economic, social good, and economic sustainability goals. And those goals will be more long-lasting because the mechanism used to deploy them, can be facilitated with supply chain AI.
Got it. So before we get into, and I think it's really great that we're about to get into the sort of sustainability and the benefits economically of matching demand, supply, and creating equilibrium. Just right before, because I like to start with the macro and then we slowly go into the micro. In terms of the macro, just because you've been in this space so long and you're a leader in this space, so in terms of macro, what do you think are some of the top trends that are going to affect supply chain in the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, so one big example that I was just talking to someone in the UK about is there's kind of an elephant in the room at the moment. And without getting into politics in too much detail, there are very large scale moves afoot that will impact sourcing in almost all consumer goods and retail supply chains, right? And it's beyond COVID. So if you're really a company that's bringing product into the UK and 80% of your product sourcing has been from China, you now want to start shifting that towards Southeast Asia as much as possible, and taking Southeast Asia from 10% of total sourcing to 20%, let's say, which is about as much as is really achievable in a large scale supply chain. That's about as much decoupling as you're really going to get. Then there's a lot that has to be done. For example, when you go out and you want to switch to new suppliers, these are now new trading relationships. How are you going to get financing for that supplier, right? How do you get those that have the money and want to apply capital to trade finance, willing to invest in your supply chain and put money forward to your suppliers? And I think that's where a big data approach becomes very interesting. And that's where we're being pulled into a lot of conversations. Because if you test that on a conventional basis only, the process just moves too slow, most companies. And if you can assess it on a conventional basis, but also start to apply big data concepts, then you can make those changes more quickly and you can make them in a more competitive way, meaning you can access capital and start mobilizing these suppliers. So there's a macro topic, which is large scale decoupling of traditional sourcing markets to new ones. And then there's execution of that, which in my view requires efficient data analytics and a progressive approach to embracing enterprise AI to be really successful. And when that can be implemented effectively, it can drive a less wasteful, more effective supply chain that benefits more people that touch that supply chain. Because most of the jobs in those supply chains are really in the SME sector, which struggles to hire if they can't get the working capital they need.
Mm-hmm. So trend number one is definitely the proliferation and the need for big data. What are like the two other overarching themes so that we can start to explore these themes in greater detail from an environmental and SME standpoint?
I think another one is the increased frequency of large scale disruption, right?
In terms of?
Whether it's COVID phase 1, COVID phase 2.
So they're just more volatile, right? There's just more and more seemingly black swan events that kind of upset the order.
It seems that way. I talked to a CEO of a very progressive company, a real player in the trade finance space here in Hong Kong on Monday. And he says, we just can't predict anything anymore. It's all out the window. We build the forecasts and then now this thing happens. What do we do? So that may be true to some extent, but you can't just throw up your hands and walk away and say, we surrender, right? You should have the models available where whether it's a certain world leader announcing a certain thing on Twitter, or it's a COVID-related crisis, or maybe it's other event.
Certain world leader.
Yeah.
Well, okay, we'll keep it at that.
ENEF2, right? So, but let's say when those things happen, how do you react? Do you go back to your board and say, well, we had no idea this was coming and we were unprepared, we were flat-footed, and demand changed here, and we lost those customers because we couldn't get the product there, and we're using all our own working capital because we can't get money from anywhere else, and well, then you're just going JCPenney. You're just going to go out of business. But if you're prepared and you have an understanding of how the models work in your supply chain, and you have a good data strategy to support your business strategy, then you can basically take an event, even if it happens like that, and then you can look at how that event impacts and how it ripples. Mm-hmm. Not just on your supply chain, but maybe on the industry itself.
Mm-hmm. Where do you see one of the sort of AI is everywhere, we talk about it every day, but why do you see that certain players are better prepared with a data strategy to meet their supply chain challenges and opportunities, and others are crumbling under the uncertainty while some are taking advantage of them? Well, like, what separates a good and a great company when it comes to this sort of data strategy, Max?
Well, I think one thing, and it kind of gets into QH's question. Like, if you're just coming from academic world and you want to get into supply chain or logistics, one of the things that you'll notice pretty quickly is that despite some degree of industry consolidation with the DHLs of the world and the Maersks and so on, and the big brands and retailers, it is still unbelievably fragmented and layered. And the result of that is that you have data silos everywhere. So there are very few brands and retailers that truly have control of their own supply chain data. Amazon basically does, because of the way they've built it from the ground up. I think H&M is also a pretty successful enterprise in that regard. And you might look at others like Inditex, and I know there's some beverage companies, Absolute Vodka and others that are doing some really interesting things around around data. So you don't have, some of the very big ones are successful at it and some are not. But when you get into those that are not, those that are really struggling, one of the problems they have is that their actual supply chain control has been distributed to so many different players. And that data then is distributed to all those different players, is that it's very hard for them to truly understand and predict what their customers need and what suppliers are needed on a day-to-day basis or will be needed to support that demand. And so things start to fall apart. And when your competitor is executing on that point and they're distributing what customers want and with less waste, that profitability increase and sustainable margin is something that just drives the success of one player and brings down the others. We bring down the JCPenney's as a classic example, but we see more and more of them in the US retail apocalypse and so on. So for the large fast-moving consumer goods companies, the Nestle's and the Unilevers of the world, they're making strides in some areas, but these very large supply chains are fragmented by country, they're fragmented within the countries. And what they basically have to do is to get a handle of that data. That's something that we're working on as a company, is developing specific tools that work for their trading partners, whether that be retailers and distributors or logistics providers, or the fintechs and the banks that are wanting to fund those supply chains. And what I predict is that in order to maintain competitiveness and survival, is that a lot of these big players will support and embrace data cooperatives and basically syndicates around data sharing, where a certain amount of research data or metadata on these supply chains, not the exact transactions about who bought what good at what store or on what omni-channel environment, but what types of products are in demand, right? And what are the flows and the networks that are being used to support distribution of those products most effectively. And then everybody that shares that research data should have a little bit more sustainability and a little bit more profit in the supply chain. And those that are outside of the data cooperatives and not available, not able to access the insights that their industry competitors have, they risk getting into trouble. And I think we're starting to see that in some industries, particularly restaurants, in automotive, particularly in more advanced markets. And that will be coming into places like Southeast Asia very soon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if there are certain people who are watching this either as a live stream or recording, and they're saying, okay, Max is spot on, in order for us to really take forward the opportunities amidst the chaos, we have to invest in a sound data strategy to match supply chains to demand forecasts. Why is that so hard to get started with? If it's so obvious, you said, yes, the data, the ownership is hard, but are there other factors like culture or fear, or what are the things that prohibit people from even getting started in that direction?
Well, I think you have one concept which is technical and another one which is somewhat cultural or attached to legacy business practices. The first one is what I would call data gravity, and the second one is just the nature of competition, right? So when you look at data gravity, basically Li and Feng, if I was to walk in and Lai Chi talked and say, hey, Li and Feng, I want to analyze your data, it'd be pretty tough ask, right? But if you go to maybe a mid-sized company and you really have the right value proposition around driving growth in their business, taking out waste, getting them access to capital they've been trying to get, they'll give the data, right? And over time, you build up the insights where you can really collaborate with those that have lots of valuable B2B data. So you have the reality of data gravity in and of itself. And I think as the bigger players start to support data sharing, and governments might start getting into the act a little bit as well. Then you can start to overcome data gravity. You also need the right AI and data-driven products to extract and deliver value back into those organizations that are sharing the data. And with these data ecosystems and consortia that I'm talking about, these can be revenue sharing in many ways, around the benefits of supply chain finance, around increased sales and otherwise. But that's one thing. One thing is sort of the challenges around data gravity principles. So another one is just the fact that not everybody likes to share and be open-minded. A lot of them want to keep trade secrets close to their heart, and a lot of them, logistics industry where I've spent most of my time, everybody says they do logistics with transparency and some sort of value-added service. The reality is most logistics companies have one or two, maybe three things that are the cash cows in that business that really feed everybody and provide a return to shareholders and put EBIT in the bank at the end of every year. And they never want to tell you exactly what that is. You basically have to work there, study it, be in the management sometimes to figure it out. So, but I think we're not really in the 8th century anymore. We're moving into a different time when people are hit by disruptions so fast. And simply the fact that some companies and businesses are getting better and better about data sharing and getting more advanced around large-scale data analytics. When they're successful, that basically proves the model, because you're simply risking that you will die if you are not part of that. And people know that there's been a lot of consolidation in consumer data. We know how powerful Facebook and the Baidus and Alphabet are, right? They're tremendously powerful organizations. But consumer data value was understood years ago. And that consolidation happened around consumer data. It is now regulated in most markets after scandals just a few years ago. But the economic value in business-to-business data is tens of times larger than the economic value that is in consumer data. It's more fragmented. It hasn't been really owned or monopolized yet, even in particular markets, but it may be. Mm-hmm. And whoever has that basically controls economies. Right. That's how powerful that will be.
Yeah. So let's switch gears a bit, right? So when you are taking on this power, right, and the future of supply chain is environmental and social sustainability. I mean, we all want a better future. We all want a better world. So maybe you can talk to me about the relationship between AI as a tool, as a strategy, as an investment between the supply chain of today that is discombobulated and messy and uncertain, and the supply chain that you envision, that your company envisions with tools like AI, so that environmental and social sustainability can be optimized.
Right. Well, I think what we have today is something that isn't sustainable. I mean, if we take the amount of stuff that is bought and moved and distributed, right, by the world's well-off or modestly well-off, and we apply that to what will be 9 or maybe 10 billion people, then we've got a real problem. So Elon Musk might be fine to jet off and take another planet, but for the rest of us, we've got to make this one work. And so much of the environmental impact is on consumer goods and retail supply chains. This is the stuff that we're all wearing, we're all eating, we're using on a day-to-day basis. It's up to 50% of GDP in many markets, right? And it simply has to become more efficient, because what the reality is there's too much of the wrong things. I'm not going to sit here and tell people or societies how much they should be consuming. That's not
Of course.
not the point, right?
But as a system as a whole, using a systems perspective, right?
Yeah, but from a systemic perspective, there's too much waste and too much unwanted stuff. So at minimum, we've got to get into making exactly the stuff that is needed and moving that, and then having that demand understood, so that a warehousing operator in Philippines has a dynamically updated demand forecast, right? For Nestle, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and local
feedback loop just has to be so much more dynamic.
Completely dynamic.
How dynamic are you thinking, Max?
Yeah, I think at the moment it's Excel spreadsheets.
Daily, monthly, like what would be it's Excel spreadsheets, and I think it's quarterly and annually, which is a nightmare. You know, daily, monthly?
Yeah, I think monthly is not good enough, but I think we can get to something that involves a daily. I mean, if you're running a facility and you've got 100 laborers and 30,000 square foot facility, and you got 500 trucks that are needed the next day, and you're planning that facility, right? You should be able to say, let's refresh this based upon the latest demand data we have for our biggest customers. Is that now 550 trucks? Do I need everybody in the warehouse tomorrow? That's the type of efficient planning. And those insights should be in the future linked to actual demand conditions, which are impacted by pandemics, by trade, by weather, and other factors. And so as a society and as private enterprises, we need to be running those types of supply chains. But what shocked me over the past several years is being on the receiving end of payments from large, very ethical, well-intended corporations, and being in the trade finance or supply chain finance programs of those big companies who talk a lot about sustainability, and being on a knife's edge of meeting payroll because you have invoices out, right? And it just surprises me, with all the money in the world that needs a home and declining interest rates and negative interest rates, right? That it is so hard to get invoices discounted by the companies that need them, that hire people, right?
Especially at the SME level. I mean, I've seen a huge ripple effect.
Huge ripple effect. And then it's just why, and it's not just me, it's not just my company, it's others as well. They're running and they're sweating it. And the things you've got to do, even when you're in a finance program, it can take forever. If you're not in the finance program, you may be SOL. I mean, it just may be game over. So there are SMEs going bankrupt. I mean, particularly with the current crisis. I mean, it's driven a lot of negative impact to employment, and that this is very undesirable in my view. It's undesirable to the governments, and if you think whether it's Pakistan or Indonesia or India, these are countries that need to create so many jobs, right? Just to stay ahead of the curve in the next couple of decades. So they go out and they say, SME sector, just start hiring. And SME sector says, can you get us credit? Can you get us working capital? And say, oh, no problem, we'll talk to the banks. We'll get IMF to help out. We'll get Asia Development Bank to help out. And they move like molasses, right? And they say, okay, we'll support the fintechs environment. And the fintechs are the fintech, then you're looking for that data, right? So it's really central part of my thesis is that you've got to solve the demand problem. You've got to solve the supply problem to meet the demand. And then you've got to be able to put the money where it's needed. Then it's better for the brand. The SMEs are really able to do the work. They won't go out of business. They're not sweating it. They can actually invest in their business instead of taking all of their cash tied up in working capital to pay salaries. And while they're waiting for receivables to be paid, they could actually make investments and hire more. And that's the only way we're going to get out of the world that we live in. And then Unilever says they want to take all the plastics out. Okay, great. I don't like plastics, right? I'd love to have more products I could buy now that don't have plastics in them. This is an unbelievably complex undertaking. And what you really want is for the SMEs that are able to produce the products and the components that make non-plastic based consumer goods to be able to come into this marketplace of supplying the big guys and the others to supply Unilever, right? And I'm telling you now, they're not going to be able to get financing because as the way the world is today, there'll be a new trader, these are new trading relationships, and it's a tough road for them. But if we really can show efficiently how these new products are going to sell, how they link to the actual supply materials, we put as much information as we can forward, we update it constantly, right? So we feed it with the metadata, with the research data from more and more comprehensive data lakes that access not just supply chain specific, but industry encompassing data. Then you put that information and that dynamic risk analysis in front of big banks, fintechs, government supported lenders. And what we're starting to hear is, okay, we might have passed on this before, but now we're going to take a hard look, right? And at the same time, then you API that data around and you get more and more offers. And you not just bring down the cost of capital, you accelerate the financing decision. And so that's a real way in which a big data play and what I call enterprise AI, which is taking all that information, very complex, updating it, building in the right machine learning algorithms, accessing more and more data, making the tools themselves more and more valuable as you get more and more data to populate the tools. And what's the result? You get what's needed, where it's needed, when it's needed, at the right cost, and the SMEs are not dying on the precipice of supply chain inefficiency. And I don't think that's too far-fetched. I think we're years away from that. And we look out a decade from now, you know, the B2C world and personal data is completely changed from what it was a decade before. Now, what we're going to see is upheaval in the business-to-business data sector, and hopefully positive change driven by openness, data cooperatives, and the right types of technologies that take this forward. And then if we do that right, then we can have 10 billion people getting the stuff that they really want, and it's not going to wreck us, right?
Absolutely. So I'm just going to wrap up with one more question from me. And for those of you who are listening, now would be a great time this is an absolutely fascinating topic because it interweaves so much of our day-to-day lives that we can't even predict. So now's a great time to think of some final questions that you'd like in the audience part of the Q&A. Please add those to the chat. But Max, my final sort of question for you on my side is, what are the actionable next steps from an AI strategy that the individual constituents need to make? So let's break that down. What should the SMEs do more of? What should the large Unilevers start doing more of? And what should the startups like yourself, who are trying to disrupt this space and who are doing amazing things with AI, making supply chains more environmental and you know, more socially sustainable, what do you think are the immediate priorities for those three stakeholders: the SMEs, the large corps, and the startups in that space?
Well, I think that the SMEs need to go digital. So if they're still on, paper and spreadsheets, they may have a problem because they won't be able to integrate into the future. The good news is there's about 1 million SaaS startups around Asia that have some sort of solution. When I started Open Port, we went down with Unilever Indonesia and we said we're going to do electronic proof of delivery. And I said, well, we would love to have that in Indonesia, but it's a paper-based world here. So come back, talk Max, in a decade. So it's been less than a decade and everything's EPOD now, right? Even from whatever, small truckers. So that's increasingly expected. So SMEs can go digital because the cost of technology has gone down because of SaaS, and they've got to do that or they've got a problem. I think for the big guys, the Unilevers, they've got to embrace a big data strategy that involves many participants. And I think the only way to do that is to start setting up data cooperatives and start sharing data, at least research data and high-level information, even with somewhat direct competitors, right? And I think that's essential for us to create the type of sustainability in supply chain ecosystems that governments will start to demand. That's my view. So I think they've got to really open up their mindset, talking about the big corporates in terms of how they work. And for local FMCGs and local companies, they've got to basically do the same thing and embrace some progressiveness around technology and sustainable business practices that local companies may have thought wasn't essential for them, but I think it actually will be. And then for the startups, that's something I thought less about, but I think it's really understanding how you fit into this type of shared economy. And I think a lot of the models are a little bit different. I think it's a little bit less about intellectual property and retained earnings, and it's a little bit more about the value of the data that you can access and what you can give back into the data ecosystem. So one example is maybe Flexport with what justified the SoftBank valuation, but I don't think anyone would mind me saying, even those at Flexport, that if you look at the terms and conditions on their shipping documents, about 3 times the size of a standard, ocean freight bill of lading or every bill of lading. And that all that extra is data analytics rights, right? And so the companies that are driving interesting valuations have a clear and cohesive story around how they use data in a way that drives shareholder value. And I think when you think about startup valuations, which I think we're lying if we say that doesn't matter to any of us, right? That has to factor in at some level. If you're really siloed and you're working just on a legacy basis, we develop tech services, SaaS tools, own our IP, we retain it, nobody gets to touch it. I don't know if that's as good as we understand how extended data ecosystems in our industry work and how we can take data from it and give value back. To me, if I was an investor, which I'm absolutely not, that would be really interesting to me. So that's kind of my thoughts on those 3 stakeholders.
Excellent. Well, Max, thanks again for a fascinating conversation. And I'm going to open up to some of the audience. So the first question comes from Prem. Prem is asking, how are companies managing the increasing geopolitical risks? Actually, Prem, do you want me to just put you on for a second? Maybe just your audio. Do you want to ask your question through audio, or should I ask it for you?
Prem, yeah.
Okay,
no,
great.
No, I will ask
Prem,
it.
go for it, please.
Thank you. Yeah, excellent conversation and sharing, Max. I really appreciate it. Although I'm a marketing academic, I do really pay a lot of attention to supply chain, and I'm actually currently advising a startup in the sustainability and traceability space as well, partly focusing on palm oil supply chains, and we're actually really talking to the Unilevers of this world. So a lot of stuff that you shared does resonate with me. But my main question here is, you know, as governments get more territorial, and of course, the increasing concentration of global supply chains in China, we've seen the disruption happening. It's been in the media, news to the pandemic. But how are companies dealing with this supply chain disruption, both from the physical flow as well as from the data perspective, as you have discussed and shared?
Yeah.
That whole notion of data, but now it from a territoriality perspective, China versus the US and other big markets who have that concentration.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, sure. I mean, I'm old enough to remember my initial work in supply chain, actually in Silicon Valley, was around Nike and electronic data interchange, EDI files for purchase orders and matching those against what was happening on ocean freight from China coming into the US. And that was, you know, you would get at best daily updates from, you would have an advanced shipping notice and then updates from the ocean carrier. At best daily updates, 80–90% of the time for shipments. I think you've got to go much more detailed and granular to be competitive today. Lianfeng has an amazing network into their suppliers in terms of how they exchange data and manage orders and POs. But you know, one company, Baihive here in Hong Kong that we've been working with, has an interesting model around even working with freelancers to expand sourcing reach into a broad supplier network and gets complementary data more easily, even for a factory that wouldn't have an EDI connection. So I don't know how you can manage these seemingly increasing geopolitical disruptions without having connectivity and dynamic connectivity to your supplier base, both your domestic base, which might be new and ramping up, as well as your China base, as well as other markets that you want to source from. And I think the companies that are going to make it and survive these disruptions, because these are big impacts. I mean, don't think that there's enough capacity in Vietnam to handle the 10,000 orders you've been pushing through China a month, right? Because you're not the only one going to Vietnam, right? And there's not that many suppliers. So you need a complex solution that gives you access to lots of markets, lots of suppliers, and that allows you to plug and play effectively. So I think some companies are doing it in a progressive way. Some of them looking at the new economy, using freelancers and like to expand their ability to get data and get access to information. And I think some are just scratching their heads and some are reactive. So that's going to determine the winners and losers. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Max. We appreciate it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks again for your question, Prem. Patrick, you have a very interesting question. Would you like to ask it via audio?
Hi, can you hear me?
Great, Patrick, you're online. Let's hear it.
Hi. Yeah, so I was just curious about really, you know, nowadays everyone wants to create predictive models, but since COVID, you know, everyone says a black swan event, but at the same time, a lot of industries just change as a whole. You know, if you look at co-work industries now, everyone's working at home, and I was just wondering, like, how would you go about planning on creating a predictive model when you have all this past data that's somewhat uncertain in terms of predicting the future?
Well, you know, one approach I like to encourage is to get your data reliance out of relational databases and one or two systems and build data lakes and data streaming tools that allow you to access information from as many sources as possible. Because what's happened is not only have we had digitalization, but it's also obviously computing power that's fueling the rise of AI. And that means that it's possible to access more and more data, to look at more and more sources, to build more and more open models and then run your enterprise on data science concepts and less software, best of breed specific concepts. So then you start setting up these more open data models to run your business. And that means you have more flexibility in terms of supporting the analytics tools that you're using to tell you what's going to happen from this tweet storm or that COVID crisis, third wave, or whatever is coming next. And this is a CEO responsibility. So it's not a CTO responsibility. The CEO needs to be able to go back to their board and say, I get this, I understand this, this is what we're doing, we're making it happen now. And a lot of them aren't able to do that. So it's about being forward moving and not flat footed. But then instead of putting your hands up in the air, then you're able to, when these next impacts come, you're able to say, all right, we have the data, we can get there. We can get the answer in a day or a week. And instead of saying we just have no clue what's could happen from this current situation. But does that make sense? Because it's a different approach. It requires openness to more data sources and also kind of connects in. So that's really where the tech and also the psychology or the business approach to these concepts start to come together. And I don't think the successful CEOs are the ones that say, oh, okay, I just did whatever my CTO said and it worked or it didn't.
Yeah. I might add to that, Max. And Patrick, I'm sure you remember from regression equations that there are certain beta factors that you can, when you're doing predictive models, that you can factor into these models based on past training data. And there are certain that you can't factor in. You don't know what you don't know. And in traditional regression equations, they have this error factor, which seems to be growing and growing with this sort of uncertainty. So maybe as a follow-on question, Max, do you see certain predictive models, and Patrick, question for you as well. Do you see certain predictive models that can say with 73% degree of accuracy, we can predict this level of price increase, but we won't even bother trying to predict SKU change, right? Are we going to start to have to bifurcate that data strategy so that only certain things we know we can predict and others we should predict that we can't predict? If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a pretty good question, actually. I think, to me, it really starts with demand for every business. And I don't think, demand is strictly go back to kind of basic Adam Smith economics. It's not, strictly an issue of commodities. And I'm not really so much talking about commodity discussions. I mean, I talked to one cement company in Indonesia. It was $1 billion supply chain. And then we get in, we talk to the CEO, we talk to their team, and they're like, yeah, we have 3 SKUs. And I said, how many SKUs do you have? And they said, well, we have 3 SKUs. So I don't know how to model the demand around that in a way that's really offering. You could maybe model the pricing for cement. And if you talk about oil and commodity-based things, then I guess that's the way you would do it. If you're talking about complex, modern consumer goods, retail apparel, you're in complexity of SKUs very quickly. And then I don't think you could really, it would not really make business sense to isolate just particularly pricing only. What we're doing, however, one project with a Hong Kong wine retailer, which we're excited about, is taking offers from suppliers, right? Matching those offers with industry data to assess the marketability of that price, building in the logistics cost and an anticipated financing cost, then putting a recommendation logic on top of it that says, okay, we're going to promote this online or to our salespeople that are just talking to buyers, right? And then we will finance that because now we know the end-to-end cash flows can be predicted, and we're going to take third-party capital to pay that supplier, not our own working capital, and we're going to make 30% on that, right? And that requires, first, we got to set up a data lake for that customer. Then we're going to need the data from SAP, all right? We got that now. And then we add, well, guess what? Industry data. Then we get data from the suppliers. And then we start sharing that with multiple trade finance providers. And then we get a rate they could never get before. And then you push it out to consumers. Now, that's in process now. That, to me, that's a supply chain AI case study that leverages, right? And because we've done that project, that CEO will, without question, have a dynamic and broad, valuable data set in the lake that can be accessed for the purposes of understanding if there's a major disruption, what the impact could be. That might be an additional product that has to be developed as an analytics tool, but it is a product that can be developed. And it's going to be 10 times more insightful than if they were just working on SAP.
Fantastic. I think we're nearing the end of our time together. So Max, maybe you could just summarize some of the key takeaways from our conversation today. In your words, what are some of the final parting thoughts that we should take in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of environmental and sustainable benefits in the future of supply chain, and of course in navigating the more choppy waters that we're seeing recently?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got some choppy waters out there. We've got some risks on the horizon, and we've gone through some things together. We're going through some things right now in Hong Kong, and as a global society, if I can say that. But so are we going to give up and just wave the white flag and say it's just going to be a mess? Or are we going to make a better world? So the way we make a better world is we, at least in part, we use these concepts to drive more sustainable economies. And that is going to mean some changes. I think it's going to mean building data consortia, which manage and curate these new industry and market data ecosystems. But everybody in those consortia will benefit. And then to make sustainability not just a buzzword, but a reality, means we're going to link sustainable development goals with recurring real business drivers in order to be successful. And then second, it means supporting those business drivers with a concrete data strategy. That probably requires an ecosystem view, not a siloed view. And then we drive the execution of this data strategy with increasingly available SaaS, and customized, and some proprietary enterprise data science and machine learning tools. And then you review and maintain that, because actually I believe this is the business in the new economy. It is the difference between success and failure. And it impacts social good in the economy as much as it impacts the balance sheet and shareholder value.
Excellent. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you again for your time, Max. Thank you again. Questions from those that were watching this. If I could ask for any of you that have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Max. Maybe Max, do you want to put your email address on the chat really quickly? And then I am also putting my email address, so feel free to reach out to myself or Max. Max is an expert when it comes to AI, to supply chain, and we're a future of work ed tech company that's helping companies in supply chain upskill and solve their data strategy issues, solve their talent issues so that they can actually make better supply chains. And I think one of the main things that we're really excited about is by applying technology and the right leverage points, whether it's supply chain or otherwise, we really can create a better future, a better supply chain. And that's a very exciting thing. So thanks again, Max, and thank you all for listening. And please find a recording of this on our YouTube channel, and do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Yeah, thanks again, Lavine. Really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun for me, and these are great ideas, I think, for discussion.
You know, we could have gone at this for another 7 hours. It's just supply chains are just so complex and so interesting. But I think for the purpose of dinner time, we'll take a break right here.
Right.
Excellent. Cheers. Stay safe, everyone.
All right. Catch up soon. Thanks.
Later.